So first I wanted to talk about, cities. You all work on cities, you're familiar with cities, and some of the contradictions around cities as these very hungry, extractive, linear metabolisms. We get all this great food delivered to our doorsteps, and we're fed by this vast global hinterlands in rural areas. There's also, of course, an abundance of inequality in our cities, food insecurity, food poverty, as well as food and environmental injustices in terms of access to environmental amenities or food and other resources. And we're rapidly cannibalizing our peri-urban food commons, as I learned about so well at the event that Shiska helped organize a few weeks ago. I think in terms of post-growth cities and politics, we ask, how do we eat in a post-growth city? So I'm just trying to set up the problem that I'm responding to. There's, of course, this whole other discourse on cities and circularity that says, we can work our way out of this crisis by just closing loops and creating more efficient infrastructures and anaerobic digesting all of our problems away, or creating new business models that recycle waste that Federico has written quite a lot about. But we see in this there's a huge kind of business as usual bias, that there's no questioning what the economy is in the circular economy, and there's an incredible techno-scientific bias towards these very large, energy-intensive, hard-to-modify technical infrastructures. So maybe we're creating more efficient urban metabolisms, but definitely not more just urban metabolisms. And within that debate, there's been not that much attention to the role of cities in food, and also very little attention to the grassroots as actors in the circular economy. So I think one question that comes out of that literature for me is, how do we manage waste in a post-growth city? Because we'll probably still have waste, I think, some. And then another thread, am I standing in the way of this? Or you don't really need to read this text. It's also just to help me structure myself. The other kind of frame is the city as commons, which you are probably also familiar with from your work in urban studies. So there's lots of different layers to this. On a very basic layer, cities provide public goods to everyone, their infrastructure, their parks, their roads, their transportation, that requires shared responsibility and care in a administrative level, but also through tax and upkeep and all those things. Then there's this more cultural level of people like Henri Lefebvre that really talk about the city as this collectively created work of art that we're all part of. So our cultural life, our civic life, the buzz and liveliness of cities as also a collectively created thing that we're all part of. And then we also have distinct commons in the city, like housing cooperatives, worker cooperatives, community land trusts, community gardens, where there are actual kind of cordoned off commons that people have deliberately created to create community-owned and managed goods in the city. So from this strand of research, I'm curious about where and when and how are the commons that will sustain the post-growth city. So I think everyone knows that we need the commons, but I think how and where and when we find them leads us in a lot of different directions. And then the other commons I'm interested in is food commons, which Siska has also done a lot of work on, so you should check her stuff out. In very broad strokes, this is a movement and academic discourse about conceiving of food as a commons rather than a commodity. And food commons is a huge umbrella that refers to lots of things, but you could say you have food commons whenever people are taking collective action to create, share, and govern and care for their food. And by food, I don't mean just the food on your plate or the food you pick at the farm, but also microbes, also genetic materials, seeds, land, knowledge, cultural heritage, meals, food safety even, public health, and even food waste. And even for some people, the entire food system can and should be a commons. So it's a big umbrella that this guy, Jose Vivero-Pol, has been very active in promoting, just to show that actually food already is a commons. It's just that we don't often have the language and governance and political tools to recognize it as such. So the kind of food as a tradable good and commodity is really just a tiny fraction of all the things that we need and use food for. So this kind of long arc of problems brings us to degrowth. There's been a huge explosion of scholarship on degrowth in food, which is really nice to see. And they've kind of identified a lot of overlap and kind of distilled the literature to pull out some principles for a degrowth food system that revolve around sufficiency, regeneration, distribution, commons, and care. That's from the McGreevy article. And then in the Lara et al. Article, where I think Giuseppe is also a contributor, and Lara Van Orst, they identify care, conviviality, autonomy, decommodification, also commons, relocalization, frugal abundance, and economic democracy. So these are quite abstract terms, but I think where I kind of intervene in this, where I see the research that I'm going to talk about, I didn't do actually with a degrowth frame. Wasn't involved in those debates, but I think it does intervene in this in terms of talking about care and commons and regeneration, conviviality and frugal abundance. So those are kind of the threads that I'm hanging on to in terms of degrowth. Which leads me to ask, how can we nourish the post-growth city? And I think the threads that come through in the research I'm talking about today are these threads around abundance, conviviality, care, food as commons, and regeneration. And I realized in writing about this, I was secretly inspired by Julia Spaniers and Giuseppe Fiula's piece on nurturing the post-growth city. Somehow their contribution stuck with me there. But first, my entry point is food. So the stage of the life of food where it is becoming or unbecoming waste. So food waste has become like a huge moral and political issue. People from all sides of the political spectrum care about food waste. They want to get rid of it. They think we make too much of it. We should revalorize it. And then I think for degrowth and commoning, the moments where food is becoming or unbecoming waste are actually really interesting, because they're moments where food is sort of falling out of cycles of accumulation. Often it's waste because it's lost its exchange value or because it's unsellable. And that literal degradation and rotting and kind of falling out leads to people having room and opportunity to assign other values. So the loss of exchange value means that we can care about other uses of food in addition to its exchange value. And that's where I think I see a lot of initiatives re-embedding surplus food or compost or food scraps or things who have sort of an uncertain status in commons and sharing and kind of trying to compost our way out of capitalism in some way. So this is kind of the interesting point for me, where food is no longer a stable object. It might be waste, it might not be, it might rot, it might kill you, we don't know. But it's an opportunity for it to become something else beyond being a commodity. So I looked at that in two separate research projects. One on community fridges in Berlin, the Fair-Tyler, which are really interesting socio-technical innovations where people can freely share surplus food. Anyone can use them. You don't have to kind of sign up or say that you're in need of food assistance or poor. So they're kind of a very destigmatizing direct form of food aid. And then the other is community composting in New York, where residents and also staff and volunteers come together to take responsibility for their organic waste and compost it locally and then redistribute it to neighborhood farms and greenery and kind of use it to care for the soil of their city. So really different examples, actually, that I think maybe in the discussion is where we'll bring them together a bit more. So now I'm going to tell you about these examples in a very rapid fashion, so hang on. And I also want to flag that when I'm talking about these examples as commons and commoning food waste, there are, of course, different kinds of commons. So not all commons are, this ideal, open to everyone, close to no one resource. Very few commons are like that, actually. They're kind of gradations of public and private, gradations of state involvement or non-involvement. And I think, I find this tool very helpful for actually parsing out what we're talking about when we're talking about commons in terms of its access, use, benefits, care, responsibility, and ownership. And I won't get too deep into this because I think my main thread that I'm trying to pull out is actually care. So food sharing day A. Has anyone heard of food sharing in the Netherlands or Germany? Or okay. So what do they do?
I was in food sharing
Maastricht. Okay. So did you rescue food and?
Yeah. So we go to little shops to save food
Mm-hmm.
and bring it to community.
Okay. Cool. And it works.
I haven't been involved for a while.
Okay.
It works sometimes because sometimes you get good quality, sometimes you get very poor quality.
Mm-hmm.
And the amounts vary as well.
Yeah.
So then the stock varies, so people don't know if there's a stable stock, so they don't come as regularly.
Ah, okay. Yeah. So there's a uneven supply or but yeah, you've essentially described what they do. They're a volunteer network that picks up surplus food from different stores and markets and redistributes it in tons of different ways. So through these like online platforms where people do peer-to-peer gifting, but also through these Verteiler, which are and community fridges, which were originally in very public spaces, like literally on the street for people to pass by and use. In Berlin, there was a lot of conflict around the community fridges with the local food safety authority. That led to kind of the closure and harassment of a lot of the fridge stewards and owners. But first I want to talk a bit about how I'm thinking about these fridges and food as a commons and food sharing day A, because there's the infrastructure itself, the fridge that people take joint responsibility for in terms of like keeping it clean, keeping it stocked, sharing information about it. There's also the governance of safety and risk. That is actually where most of the big commenting happens, or the big fights about commenting happen around risk, not food, when it comes to food sharing, which is interesting. But like every commons, food sharing relies on like a system of sanctions and rewards. So members have to prove themselves trustworthy and knowledgeable, that they can follow food safety protocols, that they're like good folks you can rely on, and they have all these funny little tools to do that, like membership quizzes and little like banana badges that you get for being an okay person, I guess. So they try to create the sense of collective responsibility and accountability, and a lot of training around food safety is part of that. So I was really interested in these socio-technical innovations as commons, because my first thought was like, oh, the fridge is a commons. Everyone can get to it. It's open to everyone. What an interesting open access food commons. And then when this conflict arose between the food sharing organizations and the local food safety authority, it actually triggered that like, oh, actually the thing that they're trying to common, I thought it was food, but it's actually risk and safety. And I saw that especially in terms of how the food safety authorities approach the fridges and the food. So currently, the way the food sharers responded to this was that basically no one understands what we're doing. This is a novel innovation, and it doesn't fit into existing forms of food governance and legislation. But we're not going to try to fit into their norm, which is based on private property and individual responsibility and personal liability. We want them to recognize our norm, which is about collective responsibility, collective care, which doesn't fit actually in EU safety regulations, surprisingly. Which is funny because they're also built on this idea that food should be safe and good for everyone. So I looked at this conflict by looking at the governance practices at different levels. So within the organization first, how people create safe, caring community fridges, how they share information and monitor what's good food. Which is also, very personal. It's about touch and taste and smell and all these things. Then also at the local food safety laws that were being implemented in Berlin, which were based on, I would say, like pretty hardcore interpretations of this law, EU 178, which basically says safe food is fully traceable food, where every point of its life, there's someone you can hold responsible. And by someone, I mean like literally one person, rather than a collective. So their way of dealing with this was that if you want to have safe food, your organization needs to kind of offer up one individual who will take the fall if anything ever goes wrong. and they refused to do that. So the way they dealt with that was actually to try to do a lot of political massage to show that actually we care about the same things. Like this area that you're really concerned about with food safety, we do all the same protocols ourselves. We follow the cold chain, But the conflict wasn't actually about safety in the end. It was really about traceability and liability. So this structure of blame that you could hold people legally liable. Which of course is very much tied to the norms of private property, not commons. And the way they've had to deal with this is a lot of the fridges closed, but then more of the fridges became more privatized commons. So they had like a lock around them and a special code that only some people had. So they were no longer these open access commons. But they are, you could say, they still are commons. They're just more narrow in terms of how their benefits are shared. So the main kind of conflict I see is that even as this organization tries to common food and common responsibility, still the way that is managed can still be in very individualizing ways, that it's really up to individuals to educate themselves, to know what's good to eat and what's not good to eat, what you can share and what you can't. And the risk itself still becomes a very individual process, actually, of how people take on risk and share risk. Now I want to take you to another location. So the other location is New York City, where I want to talk about community composting. Has anyone heard of community composting or participated in community composting? Yes? Yeah. So what process are you involved in?
Yeah, there's a neighborhood center like in my neighborhood in Amsterdam, and you can bring in your green waste there and compost it, and then usually you can get the waste back in the form of compost.
Okay, so there is this kind of give and take. And are there any like rules for what you can put in?
You can't. Yeah, there's certain things that you can't. Also things that you would think that you could be able to compost, things like tea bags or coffee filters. You don't really know. And then also with a bit thicker fruit, so like orange peels or banana peels, you have to cut it into small pieces. Okay. So compost faster.
All right. So it's not. There are some rules to this compost commons. Good to know. So it works the way Siska describes, but it also with the idea that if you localize these cycles of waste, rotting and wasting and rebuilding nutrients, you'll actually realize more of the benefits than if you send that stuff somewhere else, in a landfill or even in a compost facility in a faraway place. That it should happen as close to the source as possible. So New York City has been involved in composting for quite a while, but they kind of really upped the ante on composting as part of their zero waste by 2030 goals, which is, I don't know how that's going. But they had really an aggressive composting campaign that every New Yorker would have access to composting in one shape or form. So they had this really diversity of composting services, from curbside composting, but not everyone lives in a building that can have curbside composting, so also community composting, also community gardens, and they kind of put it out there as this is something everyone should be doing, and it's fun and accessible. And what I appreciated about their kind of haphazard approach is that they didn't prioritize one scale or one technology or one infrastructure as the solution to zero waste or composting. They said, we need it all. We need community composting, we need curbside composting, we need anaerobic digesters, and we also need community gardens. So they kind of left themselves open to a lot of different strategies without knowing in advance that one would work out or not work out. Which is different than Amsterdam, for example, which has kind of invested whole hog in waste to energy as the solution. But the other challenge for zero waste and degrowth in these things is it's not just about infrastructure and tools that get rid of the thing or get rid of waste. It's also about cultivating a different relationship to waste, where maybe it isn't waste anymore, or it's not something that we're disgusted by and grossed out by that needs to be put out of sight and out of mind and disappeared. The way this kind of what I call haphazard approach evolved was not haphazard at all. It was a result of really tireless activism and advocacy by food and environmental justice organizations beginning in the 70s. So this is kind of their legacy, that New York has this very weird composting system. So some of this patchwork has also created what I would call a very diverse economy of composting. So you have social enterprises, worker cooperatives, nonprofits, in addition to DSNY, which is the kind of municipal trash collector service, street cleaner service provider. And then within this constellation, DSNY funds the New York City Compost Project, which is basically just a funding mechanism for lots of different nonprofits who then do the community composting and do a lot of education around it. But I think that education and like the sheer amount of knowledge that's in the community through these master composting programs has created a huge spillover effect in terms of small enterprises and social enterprises and worker cooperatives who are also doing composting outside of the New York City Compost Project. But let's talk about the New York City Compost Project. It was founded in 1993. Like I said, largely because of this tireless effort by environmental justice organizations to say, we want cleaner neighborhoods, we want trees that are cared for, we want our trash picked up. And they've done a lot of things. They did this composter training program. They did kind of very informal things to clean up neighborhoods and put compost on trees. And then as part of this Zero Waste 2030 effort, they received a huge influx of funding. So they were able to kind of create much bigger sites that could process a larger quantity and variety of materials. And they were also able to create hundreds of jobs, like really good jobs, like unionized jobs with benefits full-time that you don't often find in community composting, where we're all supposed to volunteer and take care of each other, which can create barriers, especially for people of color, for people with low incomes, who are often on the margins of these movements, but often in the neighborhoods that are most affected by these environmental injustices. It has a kind of confusing governance structure, mostly through the Department of Sanitation, which then gets funding from the mayor's office. So this, you'll see, creates a lot of precarity, actually, because the mayor changes every 4 years, so you don't know what he or she's going to want. And like I said, composting is happening in all kinds of different spaces, with curbside collection, with recycling, with community gardens. But what I'm talking about for the last bit of this talk is really these nonprofit organizations that then do community composting at a neighborhood scale. And where I want to connect this to commons again is in this idea that even in the simple act of like sorting our food scraps and getting them ready to donate to a compost bin or to our food scrap pile, we're also participating in commoning, because this is actually a shared resource that we are a part of, that we do have some responsibility for, like what goes in it and out of it. And I think, compost, of course, you can use it for all kinds of things, but in some idealized cycle, it's also becoming food again and creating healthy, tasty food for people who live near the compost. So the place where I did most of my research was the Red Hook Community Farm in Brooklyn. And they have a long history of creating this urban agriculture project that then morphed into a composting project. And one of the folks who worked there, David Buckle, he was really passionate about this idea of slow compost and also combating this scarcity efficiency mindset that he was encountering in the city, that like there's just no room for composting, or community composting's not big enough, it's not robust enough. And to say like, well, no, we need to slow down and actually think about how we allocate time and resources, and also think about labor, and maybe sustainability is very laborious and a lot of work, and how do we make time for that labor? So for him, it was really a trigger to like question urban planning, question time use, question work, which he was a very inspiring person that really kind of brought people into this cult of composting. As I mentioned, at the Red Hook Farm, they kind of cultivated this slow compost approach. So they didn't use any fossil fuels or carbon-based Methods on site, everything was wind powered or human powered or solar powered. So mostly that was just like people shoveling stuff and wheelbarrowing it around. And they really closed the loop on site. So they also grew food on site that was then distributed in the neighborhood for sale, but also through barter markets that were run by another agency that worked on the site that did kind of green jobs training for youth in public housing. So I would say they were trying to do things in a really different way, but also in a very intentional way that was about slowing the process down to such an extent that people could also enjoy it and find it pleasurable. So it became like the hottest free workout in Brooklyn for a big cohort of people who would just show up every Saturday to shovel waste. And they loved it. And then for people who don't want to do that work, there's also benefits like having well cared for street trees or having access to healthy organic vegetables. These are some pictures of the site. So it is quite big actually, but all of it is still, there's no tractors involved or gas. Everything is just done by hand. I think the reason to do things by hand is also to bring people in touch with the materiality and think about also the wider material consequences of our waste infrastructure. So a lot of the policymakers who I talked to about community composting, they were really concerned about the pressure to get everyone using the curbside composting program where you get your bins picked up, because they saw this program as actually contributing to existing environmental injustices. So it was putting more trucks on the street and putting more waste infrastructure in neighborhoods that were already overburdened by waste infrastructure. So they really saw community composting as an alternative for actually reducing some of these harmful materialities like fine particles in the air, but also maybe getting people in touch with a totally different set of materialities around microbes and soil and food and stink and rot. So this is a field where they also grow some food on the site. And what I found really exciting about these materialities is actually the way that they moved people. They kind of opened up at different ethical orientations towards waste in the material world. So sometimes that took the form of like being confronted, of like people showing up at the farmer's market with a bag of perfectly good food and feeling bad that they didn't eat it or that they didn't plan their meals for the week very well or something. And then looking at it and being like, oh, that's interesting. Let's think about how that happened, or wow, look at this whole pumpkin we found in the compost pile. And people were more open to being just kind of surprised and curious about food waste in this new setting. So it's not in an enclosed bin. It's kind of out in the open in a pile where anyone can see it. We're also used to kind of hiding our waste so no one looks at it. And then in the process of like laboring and caring for food waste, people just got really excited in ways that you wouldn't expect. So people would describe themselves as like feeling jazzed or just so enchanted by like the metabolic liveliness of the world around them, that they could like see the steam coming off these piles and like feel the heat of like the microbes hitting them in the face, or smells that they weren't used to. But there was a lot of joy in being part of that process that we don't get to experience when we just like put our stuff in bins and wave it goodbye. And this kind of care and attention towards compost is something that scholars of waste ethics like Gay Hawkins have paid a lot of attention to. That actually like care and attention is a way of disrupting this cycle of distance and denial and disposability that undergirds our linear waste infrastructure. When you start caring about materials in this way, it's hard to go back to that, or that structure doesn't make sense anymore. I think I'm going to skip this one. Just to say that there are a lot of diverse economies making this possible in terms of public funding, public land, and a lot of voluntary labor as well. And the other kind of, after I did this research, the point I arrived at was that, composting brings us into communion with a more than human commons. We labor alongside microbes and all kinds of other creatures. But it's also a form of care work, sort of not just caring for the food scraps, but caring for like the wider worlds that they're interdependent with. And I started kind of digging into this approach that I've called careful circularity, to actually say, like, well, what happens when we put care at the center of our discussions of circular economy instead of material flows, for example, or economic efficiencies? What happens when we pay attention to embodiment and emotion that comes with that care work? What happens when we actually follow like the circuits of care that food waste or food scraps or surplus food gets embedded in, and where does it go? And that thinking was very inspired by our colleague Martin Callisto Friant, who really advocates for a social circular economy or a circular society, where we're not just obsessed with like more efficient material flows, but actually the redistribution of wealth and power and knowledge in society. So we shouldn't limit ourselves to the material. And of course, I'm a feminist geographer, so I'm inspired by feminist geographers who are rethinking economy and materiality and care and all these things. I think I covered this. Basically, community composting has a lot of care in it that is not just for ourselves and our communities, but also for these more than human arrangements. And also for care for distant people who would otherwise bear the unequal environmental burdens of our waste. But I would like to end on a sad note. Unfortunately, for the second time in the last 4 years, the program has been completely defunded by the mayor, responding to a budget crisis. So hundreds of people who had these really good jobs don't have these jobs now, and thousands of people have lost their access to community composting. So this even caught the attention of The Guardian recently, which is embarrassing for them. But I want to bring this back to degrowth and kind of joining these two cases together, which maybe you can help me do more in the discussion. So back to community composting and community fridges. What do these things have in common? I think they're both really cool socio-technical innovations and infrastructures, and I think they support a lot of degrowth food practices like frugal abundance, conviviality, care, commons, and regeneration. So I think they're interesting to look at for how they further those activities. They're also settings for practicing new material relations with waste that we might not otherwise have access to or have in our daily routines, and being moved by matter and material. And when I talk about being moved by matter, I'm really talking about that emotional embodied reaction we have when we are sorting through food scraps or sorting through surplus food to decide what's good enough to share with someone else, what's still edible, what's not. And it is kind of cultivating a different embodied knowledge around food that we're not used to doing, because we just read the date label or say this is good, this is not good. And also the bodily labors that come from actually dealing with the material weight of that stuff. So in all of these movements, there are people literally like carrying tons and tons of surplus food and food waste and food scraps like on their backs. And I think that is a weird bodily learning that teaches people about like the labor of change and makes them patient and slow. And also cues them into like how much work this is and what an enormous problem it is. So I think, yeah, there is something about the inefficiency of these tools that I think is also really interesting. But I think when these tools orient us towards caring relations and make space for care by slowing down, by not trying to be as efficient as they could be, they make room for people to reflect and to feel and shift their ethical stances towards waste from guilt and shame and denial towards curiosity, joy, pleasure, enchantment, even falling in love. So when these funding cuts happen, people are heartbroken. They love being able to compost. And it's not just like, oh, this is a service I'm entitled to as a citizen. They are in love with the materials that they share with other people. So if you've composted, you feel this way. And similarly, people who are sharing surplus food and rescuing surplus food in these fridges, they also love that work. They love the materiality of picking up these objects and circulating them and giving them and gifting them and receiving them, and they are very excited to carry these objects with them. So my conclusions sort of are that, yeah, community fridges and community composting, and of course many other things that I haven't talked about that you probably know more about, offer new material, ethical, economic, and emotional entanglements around food and waste in this moment of transition and transformation where it's maybe rotting or lost its value or becoming something else. That there is an important role for infrastructure and socio-technical innovations in supporting the commoning of food waste, because of course there's lots of ways that we could deal with food waste and food that aren't commons-based. And that these infrastructures can also be designed in such a way that they can support bodily learning and emotional attachments and transitions that I think are, yeah, quite essential for a convivial transition to a post-growth city that's not modeled on this like crisis and scarcity mindset, that you can also do degrowth and use less resources in a way that's quite pleasurable. So I'll end there. Looking forward to your questions and helping me make these connections a bit more.
Thank you, Oona.